Hello, welcome to Non-Dual Christianity. In this video, we'll explore the topic of hell from the standpoint of why do so many Christians believe in this idea of a place of eternal torment. I'd like to talk about some assumptions that I believe are being made without realizing it, and specifically that these assumptions are not necessarily biblical. Ultimately, I hope that this gives you some permission to actually question the doctrine and to see that it is not a certainty. I believe that this particular doctrine causes a vast amount of spiritual trauma. It really hurts people. And so I hope this is healing. So the first assumption is that the soul itself is immortal. And if the soul is immortal, then it needs to have a final resting place. And then what we'll see with the idea of punishment or abandonment, it can go one of two places, either with God or not with God. And yet this assumption about the soul being innately immortal comes far more from Plato than from the Bible itself. The Bible actually talks about God alone being immortal. So unless you would say that, sure, God alone is immortal, and therefore your soul is divine, which is what the non-dual worldview would say, the soul being somehow immortal and not God, that's very much a pagan concept. The second assumption is that it's possible for God or the divine nature to abandon some portion of creation, or in this case, someone. And as we talked about in our videos on what is God and where is God, his being, immanence, you'll see that this idea of abandonment is not possible. God must be present in upholding all of creation, because all of creation, all of form is taking place within the divine consciousness moment by moment. And even if there's this idea that somehow sin cannot exist in God's presence, that's not because God is somehow pure and must flee from sin, but it's more along the lines of if sin enters his presence, that sin is healed or resolved. So it is not possible for God to abandon. And also, even the very nature of love, it is not possible for the nature of love to abandon. Even if you're going to say that someone chooses something, love does not abandon. There's always a connection, and at the very least the connection because of the divine unity underlying all of creation. And then the final assumption is that there's some sort of a cosmic law that requires punishment. So this really is taking our version as humans, and especially Western, modern humans, and saying that, if you break law, you're punished for it. And then our version of punishment is some kind of retribution. Especially in America, we like to lock people up and they serve a sentence until they've sort of paid their debt, so to speak. And yet really this assumption that God works that way is us creating God in our image. Because it's taking our concept of justice, is typically what we would call it, elevating it to cosmic proportions and then holding God accountable to that. Even to such an extent that we would say, if God simply chose to forgive sin, that would not fulfill the needs of justice. Or God would never choose to simply forgive sin because of justice. These are just all ways of holding God to our version of this abstract justice principle. And some people might say, well, the Bible talks about judgment. That sure sounds like our law. And what I would reply to that is, when the Bible talks about judgment, even though it sounds scary and there's these punishments and these threats, the purpose of judgment is to free people. It is to try to show people what is actually happening in their lives, in their society, in order to show them the truth so that they can be free from it. So judgment is not for the sake of what is your punishment. Judgment is for the sake of naming something as true so that you can then be free from it. So those three assumptions, the soul's immortal, that God can abandon, and that there's this cosmic law requiring punishment, I think drive much of the motivation behind hell, or the theology of hell. It's not biblical. It doesn't come from the Bible itself. Why? Why would people do this? Well, I think that ultimately it's because of anxiety and control. So there's this anxiety because of our felt sense of separation from the divine nature, which we've talked about in the sin and death videos. And because of that anxiety, we look for ways to control the world around us. And if I can convince you to believe in my version of God, my version of what happens at this cosmic level in the afterlife, then I can also convince you that you need to agree with my moral code. So it's kind of like, if you can get in line and agree that I'm right about my version of God, you have to do this to go to heaven or avoid hell, then you also need to agree with my moral code. And we see this even because in passages like Revelation 21:8 or Matthew 26:46, which are typically used to talk about this idea of eternal hell and convince people that there's hell, the description of those who are going to hell is all behavioral. So many Christians play this mind trick because they would use these passages saying, if you do these things, you will go to hell, as evidence of hell, and yet turn around and say you don't have to do anything but believe in order to go to heaven. And this creates this tension, because really what you're saying is you do have to do certain things to go to heaven and avoid hell. And the claim that it's not behavior-based is just a mind trick. And even based on the passages that are used for evidence, you can see that that's what's happening, that substitution. So in the end, yes, it seems as though our version of hell is creating God in our image and hell in our version of what justice is as compared to his. My final observation would be that in the versions in the church I grew up in, people tried very hard to keep their children from going to hell. They would put a lot of pressure, the parents, on, you don't want to go to hell, don't you want to be with me and your mom, don't you? And you're using the social pressure, this idea of abandonment from your parents, to get you to believe in heaven, hell, and agree that, okay, I'm going to do these things to not go to hell. But the irony is, the reason parents put so much pressure on their children is because they don't want their children to go to hell. They would not choose to send their children to hell, which is why they put so much pressure on them to believe certain things. And yet, somehow they believe that God is capable of sending his children to hell. So the sad part is almost like we've created some of the most harmful or worst parts, so to speak, of ourselves and have placed those onto God. And yet, the parts of us that resound and are more according to the pattern of love and connection with those we most care about, with our children, we don't attribute those to God. So kind of get the worst of both worlds when it comes to the current popular doctrine of an eternal hell. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that perhaps you can feel a little bit more relaxed in the divine nature that you are, and realize that you are already where you would most hope to be. There's no possibility of abandonment, and from that standpoint, there's no eternal stakes here to get it right. Thank you so much for exploring this topic with me today.